January 27th, 1302. I want you to picture the chaos.
Right.
The government of Florence, a city Dante Alighieri loved, a city he served, has just leveled these charges of embezzlement against him, finds him guilty in absentia.
And he's not even there to defend himself.
Not even there. The sentence comes down, a staggering fine, and, well, even worse, perpetual exile. This was a man who was completely devoted to the political life of his city, and then in a single moment, it's all gone. He's cast out forever. He never, ever set foot in Florence again.
It's one of the most, truly painful, dramatic, and consequential moments in all of Western literary history. Dante's entire world, his political life, his social standing, his finances, it all just collapsed.
Absolutely.
But that brings us to the central question we really have to grapple with in this deep dive. Was his catastrophic personal failure just something that led to, a long spiritual memoir? Or was his epic journey, that incredible, meticulous passage through hell, purgatory, and heaven, a direct coded reflection of his political displacement, a reflection of the spiritual crisis that came with it?
I think the magic of Dante is that the answer has to be a resounding both. He's standing right on the hinge point of history. He's a medieval man completely steeped in scholastic philosophy, Catholic faith, the suffocating rigidity of these political factions.
But at the same time,
his soaring literary ambition and his revolutionary choice to write in the vernacular language in Italian. That absolutely defines the coming age of the Renaissance. He's looking backward and pushing forward all at once.
Precisely. And we are incredibly lucky to have such detailed historical sources. We have minutes from the Council of the 100, records of his military service, even the specific charges that were leveled against him. We can see his precise political actions.
And we can lay those actions right alongside his work.
Exactly. Right alongside the explicit reflection of his shifting loyalties, his simmering political rage, and that profound personal grief, especially over Beatrice, all of it woven directly into the three-part structure of the Divine Comedy.
Okay, let's unpack all of it. What we're aiming for here is to give you the ultimate shortcut to understanding Dante. We're focusing not just on what he wrote, but why he wrote it. Our mission is to understand how the intense, chaotic, and often brutal political crucible of late 13th century Florence was the absolutely necessary forge for his ultimate enduring legacy.
It's the story of how a political failure of the highest order led to a cultural triumph that redefined a continent. We're going to trace that path from the gold-drenched streets of Florence all the way to the deepest pit of the Inferno.
To really understand the pain of his exile, you first have to grasp the sheer magnitude of the home he lost. So let's start in Florence, around 1265. Dante was born Dante Alighieri. His family background was, it was modest.
It was modest, especially when you compare them to the true patrician families of the city. His father, Alighieri, was a businessman, a moneylender.
So they were on their way up?
Oh, definitely upwardly mobile. They were trading, engaging in money lending to build their wealth, but they were still firmly in the middle rank of Florentine society. And this context is so important because Dante later spent a lot of energy trying to, let's say, elevate his own lineage. He proudly claimed descent from his great-great-great-grandfather, Cacciaguida.
Right, Cacciaguida the Knight.
Cacciaguida the Knight, a warrior who had served the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III during the Second Crusade.
Wait a second, so he's using a distant ancestor to connect himself to the Holy Roman Empire, the enemy of his own faction, the Guelphs, even while he was still living in Florence.
And that's the first hint of this internal contradiction that defines him. He wanted to claim that noble imperial heritage, even while his living family was strictly business class and strictly Guelph. It shows you this powerful ambition he had to transcend his immediate status.
And the city itself was the engine that powered that kind of ambition. When Dante was born, Florence wasn't just another Italian town.
Not at all. It was a European metropolis. It was massive for the time, home to maybe 40 or 50,000 inhabitants.
And it was the undisputed financial engine of Europe.
The scale of wealth generation there is really hard to overstate. Florentine bankers, we're talking about families like the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Frescobaldi, they ran these huge international networks. They weren't just loaning money locally, they were financing entire geopolitical structures. They were funding the military campaigns of English king and the papacy itself.
And this incredible concentrated wealth created its own currency, the gold florin, which was first minted in 1252.
Yes, the florin. It became the global reserve currency of the medieval world. It was so trusted, so reliably pure, that it completely displaced older coin. It became the preferred medium for major international trade all across the continent. This is crucial. Dante grew up in a city where money, not just land or noble birth, was the ultimate power broker.
And you could see it in the architecture. The sources tell us that these iconic structures that we now associate with the glory of the Renaissance, the vast Duomo Santa Maria del Fiore, the Palazzo Vecchio, the seat of government,
Santa Croce,
all of them are only just beginning construction, and they were financed entirely by this new mercantile wealth. These buildings were literal, tangible symbols of the shift away from feudalism and towards finance.
But there was a shadow hanging over this incredible economic dynamism.
The big one.
The huge, centuries-old political problem.
Yeah.
The massive power struggle between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. This wasn't local politics.
Yeah.
This was the cosmic conflict of the age, and Florence was trapped right in the middle of it.
Okay, let's ground this for a moment. We're talking about the legacy of Charlemagne, crowned emperor way back in 808. The title was reasserted by Otto I in the 10th century, but the emperors mostly ruled from Germany. They'd only sweep down into Italy for their grand imperial coronations in Rome.
And those long absences created an environment where the Italian city-states gained this radical independence. And who filled that power vacuum?
The papacy.
The papacy. The conflict really solidified during the 12th century investiture controversy, which was a dispute over who had the ultimate authority to appoint bishops. But it was really a question of who had ultimate power.
And that dispute hardened into two permanent, entrenched, and often brutal factions that just permeated every aspect of Italian life for centuries.
The Guelphs, who were pro-papal, and the Ghibellines, who were pro-imperial. And we need to remember these weren't political parties in the modern sense. They were deep, often hereditary loyalties. It was in your blood.
The conflict intensified dramatically with Emperor Frederick II of Swabia, the Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world.
He united his massive German, Italian, and Sicilian king. The papacy, literally fearing encirclement by imperial power, just doubled down on its anti-imperial stand. And this put Florence, as a historical papal ally, directly on the front lines against the imperial force.
So for a few decades, Florence was volatile, it was flipping side, but after Frederick II died in 1250, and then his son Manfred was finally defeated and killed in 12.
The Guelphs were permanently restored to power in Florence. That was in 1267, when Dante was just a toddler. So he grew up in a city that had definitively chosen the papal side.
But crucially, this Ghibelline defeat didn't bring peace.
Not at all. The constant tension of the imperial threat was just replaced by internal structural tension within the victorious Guelph party itself. By the time Dante was entering adulthood, the Guelphs were already fracturing into the white Guelphs and the black Guelphs, led by the Cerci and Donati families.
Local rivalries.
They were local rivalries, yes, but they were about who got to control the wealth of the city and, maybe more importantly, who controlled its relationship with the papal banks.
That's the environment he had to navigate. So how did a young man from a modest, non-noble background manage to climb the ranks? Let's look at his education.
His education was exceptional. He certainly started his formal studies in the 1270s, learning Tuscan dialect, acquiring Latin grammar. But the crucial connection he made was with Brunetto Latini.
Ah, yes.
An incredibly eminent intellectual and statesman who effectively served as Dante's mentor for rhetoric, for letter writing, and most importantly, for political philosophy.
Latini was the master of communication. He was the man who knew how the gears of Florentine government turned. This relationship gave Dante access to the highest echelons of civic learning. It's telling that he calls Latini master in the Inferno, and even though Latini is placed in hell, the respect Dante shows him is profound. It's a source of great debate among scholars.
And beyond his intellect, Dante also showed physical commitment to the Guelph cause. Despite being financially reliant on inherited asset income, which put him somewhere between the merchant class and the minor aristocracy, he was far from politically idle. He served as a cavalryman in the Guelph army.
And he didn't just serve, he saw major action. He fought at the pivotal Battle of Campaldino in 1289. This was a significant Guelph victory over the Ghibellines of Arezzo.
A huge victory.
Being a veteran of a major, decisive battle like that would have brought him immense personal prestige and really solidified his standing within the triumphant Guelph political structure.
And that military and intellectual background really explains the paradox of his social circle. He didn't have inherited aristocratic titles, yet his closest companion, like his best friend and poetic mentor Guido Cavalcanti or Minato Portinari.
They were the sons of the ultra-wealthy financial elite.
Absolutely. His literary talent was his passport into their world.
That's a really important. His genius bought him entry into that circle, but that circle was already deeply entangled in the factional politics and the flow of Florence. He was accepted as an equal, but that acceptance came with, unspoken political expectations.
And this is where we transition from the political context to the, let's say, emotional engine of Dante's work, Beatrice Portinari. The sources paint this beautiful, almost mythic picture of a courtly love, the inspiration for all his poetry, a woman he first met in 1274 when he was only 9 years.
The narrative around Beatrice is what has captured the imagination of the Western world for centuries. But if we really drill down into the source, the reality, as you suggested, is much less romantic and far more rooted in Florentine pragmatism.
Absolutely. The strict social codes of the time meant that Dante didn't realistically encounter Beatrice again until 1283. And by then, the deal was already done. She was already married to Simone de' Bardi, a member of the powerful Bardi banking family.
Wait. So the love of his life, the central figure in his spiritual vision, was inextricably linked to the very black Guelph faction that would later engineer his downfall.
It's the ultimate Florentine irony. This foundational, inspiring relationship for one of the world's great poets was largely platonic, and it was politically charged from the very beginning. The marriage between a Portinari, who tended to sympathize with the white Guelphs, and a Bardi, who were deeply allied with the black Guelphs, that was a common strategy.
A political merger.
Exactly. It was a political merger designed to prevent armed conflict between these financial power.
And his own marriage followed a similar trajectory. In 1277, Dante's family arranged his marriage to Gemma Donati.
Yes, Gemma, a distant cousin of the powerful Donati family, who were the leaders of the black Guelphs. This further entrenched Dante, or at least his familial connections, within that powerful emerging black Guelph faction.
The marriage records themselves are interesting. The dowry was extremely low, something like 200 small florins, which translates to a meager 12 gold florins, led to historical debate, right?
It has. Was this a reflection of the modest status of Gemma's branch of the family, or did it reflect the Alighieri family's own relatively modest status, meaning they couldn't command a better match?
You don't know for sure.
But regardless of the economics, the silence that followed is the most controversial detail. Dante, the master wordsmith, never once referred to Gemma in any of his writings. Not once, not even in his autobiographical work. And this led early biographers like Boccaccio to claim Dante was trapped in an unhappy marriage and deliberately abandoned her after his exile.
It's impossible to know the real, but that deliberate omission, it certainly speaks volumes about where his emotional and poetic focus lay.
Completely on the idealized, unavailable figure of Beatrice.
That focus intensified dramatically after he met the married Beatrice again in 1283. It spurred him into serious poetry. He wrote an anonymous sonnet, sort of an intellectual challenge, inviting people to interpret a dream he'd had about her.
And it was Guido Cavalcanti, the aristocrat and friend, who responded to this poetic challenge. Their collaboration became the foundation for the Dolce Stil Novo, the new sweet style.
So what made it new?
What made it new was its intellectual depth. It consciously moved beyond the simple, surface-level declarations of courtly love. It drew inspiration from the sophisticated poetic traditions of the French troubadours and the Sicilian school, but it elevated the language of love. It used sophisticated Tuscan vernacular to explore the theological and philosophical implications of love more as a pathway to the divine.
This shift required immense intellectual discipline, and the path was really set when tragedy struck. Beatrice died unexpectedly in June of 1290.
Her death propelled Dante toward literary recognition. He channeled his profound grief into Vita Nova, published around 1294. And this book was just groundbreaking. It was a hybrid. It combined his verse with autobiographical prose commentary, effectively presenting Beatrice not just as a woman he loved, but as a symbolic conduit to divine wisdom.
The Vita Nova was critical for two reasons. It cemented his reputation as this formidable writer of sophisticated philosophical prose, and it fundamentally argued that the Tuscan dialect of Italian was just as capable of expressing profound universal concepts as Latin, the language of the church, and of all scholars. This is his first great linguistic political.
And in seeking comfort after Beatrice's death, he just immersed himself in philosophy. He was reading the Roman statesman Cicero and the late Roman philosopher Boethius. He even attended lectures as a lay student at Florence's leading theological institutions, the Dominican and Franciscan schools, specifically to study Aristotle's Ethic. He was building the philosophical scaffolding that would define his future epic.
But his literary and philosophical ascent ran directly into the currents of political power. The 1290s saw a massive shift in Florentine governance. Power was being pried loose from the old feudal nobility, the magnates, and concentrated in the hands of the new financial class, the merchants.
The executive power was in the College of Priors, 6 individuals chosen from the major guild. And here's the key technical detail that led to the city's instability. They served extremely short 2-month terms.
That's a profound detail. 2-month terms. That's not designed for stability.
Not at all.
It's designed for rapid turnover and widespread participation among the merchant class, which means the government was perpetually volatile, always in crisis management mode.
Exactly. The opportunity for political office was frequent, but the window to enact any kind of lasting policy was basically non-existent. The mechanism that allowed Dante his entry was the Ordinances of Justice of 1293, which were designed to prevent the nobility, the magnates, from holding certain high offices. The system was now geared toward the guild.
So to become eligible for the highest executive office, the priorship, Dante had to enroll in a guild. And this leads to the famous, slightly cynical choice he registers with the Guild of Physicians, Apothecaries, and Haberdashers.
It sounds absurd, doesn't it? That the man who had mapped the Christian cosmos had to register as a haberdasher. But it was entirely practical. It was one of the broadest guilds, encompassing anyone who traded in goods used by apothecary, including books and paper. And crucially, a compromise in 1295 allowed men to join a guild without actively practicing the profession. It was a loophole for the ambitious intellectual.
And he proved his commitment immediately. In 1295, as a member of the General Council of the Republic, he spoke and voted in favor of this compromise, cementing his commitment to the popular government and the rule of law against the old aristocratic class.
A stance that placed him at increasing odds with his aristocratic friend, Guido Cavalcanti, who represented that old elite. Dante, the pragmatic moderate, was clearly aligning himself with the new emerging power structure.
And his trajectory was swift. He served on the Special Council of the Captain of the People, then the Council of the Hunt. By 1300, he was a known, trusted, and active member of the moderate Gulf Party, heading straight for the pinnacle of just as that world was preparing to complete explode.
By the time Dante was elected prior in mid-June 1300, that internal Gulf split had metastasized into open civil conflict. This is the black versus white Gulf schism, and it's so critical to understand the difference.
Okay, give us the breakdown. What were they fundamentally fighting about beyond just family names like Cerci and Donati?
It was a complex mix of old money versus new money and differing external alliances. The white Guelphs, led by the Cerci family, were often seen as slightly more conservative, drawing support from the lower classes and the de facto Ghibelline minority. They favored more independence from papal influence, and Dante sympathized with it.
And the Black Guelphs, led by the Donati.
The opposite. Ultra-conservative, intolerant of their rivals, and crucially, they maintained absolute fidelity to the Papacy, specifically to Pope Boniface VIII, whose critical banking ties were with the Black Guelph fact. This made them powerful, both locally and internationally.
And Dante's 2-month term as prior in 1300 happened right at this boiling point. Just days after he took off, magnates attacked the guild heads during a public ceremony, and that forced the government.
The priors, including Dante, responded with the unanimous, dramatic decision that was designed to appear utterly impartial. They exiled the leaders of both factions to restore order. This was the moment of peak moral conviction for Dante.
It was a huge risk.
A huge risk. The white Guelphs obeyed the order. The Black Guelphs initially threatened an insurrection, but eventually left. However, the equilibrium didn't last. The white Guelphs, Dante's actual sympathizers, were soon recalled from exile, but this decision had immediate and tragic personal consequences for Dante.
That's right. Guido Cavalcanti, Dante's closest friend and mentor in the Dolce Stil Novo, had been exiled as a white Gulf leader. He contracted malaria or something similar while in the swampy Riena and died shortly after Florence.
And so Dante, despite his effort to appear neutral through that dual exile order, was now viewed by the triumphant Black Gaels as personally responsible for the death of a prominent white Guelph leader, especially because they were the only faction recalled prematurely. He had sealed his own fate with his pursuit of impartial justice.
So by the time his term ended, the white Guelphs were clinging to power, but they had earned the irreversible wrath of Pope Boniface VIII. The Pope saw them as dangerously soft.
Cardinal Matteo d'Acquasparta issued a papal interdict on the city. Meanwhile, Corso Donati, the leader of the Black Guelphs and a distant relative of Dante's wife, went straight to Rome. His lobbying campaign was simple. He warned the Pope that the white Guelphs were planning to restore the anti-papal Ghibelline, a truly terrifying prospect for Boniface.
And Dante continued to serve the increasingly precarious white Guelph government throughout. He voted against the Pope's request for Florentine cavalry papal military, showcasing his moderate yet decidedly anti-papal temper. He was pushing the boundary.
The boundary broke in November 1301. Charles of Valois, the younger brother of the King of France, entered Florence under the guise of being a peacemaker. But he was acting on Black Guelph appeals and with papal blessing. The white Guelph government collapsed immediately. Corso Donati returned in triumph. The Black Guelphs began an immediate, brutal campaign of reprisal and plunder against white Guelph properties, including Dante's own home.
And the political consequence was swift. The new Black Guelph regime launched legal proceedings against all the priors who had served since 1299. In January 1302, Dante was specifically charged with embezzlement, extortion, and hostility toward the...
And crucially, Dante was not present for the charge. He was most likely on a diplomatic mission in Rome at the time, ironically, to plead Florence's case to the very Pope who was engineering his downfall. The sentencing was done in absentia, and the result was devastating. a massive fine of 5,000 florins, perpetual exile, and the absolute confiscation of all his property.
And if he had dared to return,
The sentence was death by burn.
5,000 florins. I mean, that's an astronomical amount, certainly far beyond what a man of his moderate means could ever pay. It was a politically motivated charge designed purely to remove him permanently.
Absolutely. The charges were vague. They were common political weapons used against deposed officials. Dante was one of over 600 white Guelphs who were exiled. His immediate family, Gemma and the children, they remained in Florence, likely protected by their Donati relation. But Dante was suddenly, definitively homeless and ruined.
So Dante, the intellectual, the moderate statesman, is pushed to the margins. He immediately joined the exiled white Guelphs who, in a desperate, last-ditch attempt to return, made the shocking, cynical alliance with their historical mortal enemy,
The Ghibelline exiles.
the Ghibelline.
This coalition was born of desperation, and it proved disastrous. After some initial skirmishes, they regrouped for a massive assault on Florence on July 20th, 1304. They fielded an enormous force, something like 1,600 cavalry and 9,000. It was a total military failure, repulsed by the staunch Black Guelph defense.
So that failure marked the definitive breaking point for Dante.
It did. Sources record that following this catastrophe, Dante completely broke with what he publicly called the wicked and foolish company of his former white Guelph ally. He realized their petty ambitions and desperate alliances were no better than the Black Guelphs he'd been fighting.
He was done with all of them.
He abandoned all military attempts to return and, with profound irony, was forced to seek refuge with the Ghibellines, the Della Scala family in Verona. The Guelph partisan was so profoundly betrayed by his own faction that he was forced to embrace the imperial cause, a philosophical shift that would fundamentally define the next 2 decades of his life and his greatest work.
The betrayal was complete. He had lost his home, his political identity, and his sense of belonging. The only thing he had left was his...
It's a remarkable historical paradox, isn't it? The personal ruin of Dante Alighieri was the cultural gain of Europe. This forced exile, though economically devastating, it freed him from the suffocating local politics and pushed him toward this universal intellectual ambition. His intellectual productivity during this period is just astonishing. Suddenly unmoored, he was forced to travel all across central Italy, dependent on the hospitality of various lords, always seeking stability and academic resource. We know he likely returned to Bologna, the site of the oldest university, probably seeking a teaching position and using its vast...
And the earliest major work that explicitly charts this ideological transformation is Convivio, or The Bank. It was planned as this incredibly ambitious philosophical treatise, a grand 14-book project written in Italian, combining prose and verse. He only completed 3 of the plans.
What's fascinating here is that he chose to write it in Italian rather than the expected Latin, and he addressed it directly to the Italian nobility. He was using the vernacular, the language of the people, to discuss high abstract philosophy. It was a clear statement that the intellectual elite didn't need to be defined by Latin anymore.
And within the pages of Convivio, he lays bare his profound ideological shift. He explicitly recognizes the crippling chaos caused by the incessant petty competition between the independent Italian city-state, the very fighting that ruined.
And this realization led him to a dramatic conclusion. The papacy was not the unifying force it claimed to be. In fact, Dante argued, the popes were pursuing narrow, self-interested political goals, and they were compromising their spiritual authority by engaging in these temporal power struggles. He had to invent a theory of global governance because Florence had failed him so miserably.
So, if the Guelph cause was fundamentally flawed and the papacy compromised, what was the universal solution? He looked back to the ideal of the Holy Roman Empire.
Even though the empire had been largely absent from Italian affairs for generations, he advocated for the empire as the only viable supranational institution capable of unifying Christendom and promoting genuine peace based on shared noble and intellectual value, rather than financial rivalry or regional squabbling. He needed a single, impartial power to enforce universal justice.
But this grand political vision required a grand cultural vehicle, and that meant addressing the massive, debilitating problem of linguistic fragmentation in Italy.
He was astonished by the sheer linguistic diversity he encountered in his travels. He famously noted that the differences were so acute that even districts of Bologna had distinctive dialects. How could a unified intellectual or political life flourish if people couldn't even communicate clearly across a few dozen miles?
This challenge led directly to his masterpiece of linguistic theory, De Vulgari Eloquentia, on the eloquence of the vernacular. He undertook a truly scholarly effort, charting the historical evolution of languages and setting out to create a standard Italian vernacular.
He wasn't just observing, he was engineering. He sought to distill a curial vernacular, a language fit for court and high literary expression, based on universally shared words and grammar, stripped of jarring regional accent. He argued that the best elements were found in his native Tuscan, but refined and elevated. This work gave the Tuscan dialect the theoretical backing it needed to eventually become the standard national language.
And here's the magnificent paradox of the treatise. The entire argument for the legitimacy of the vernacular. It was written in Latin.
And that choice is the key to understanding his strategy. He knew his intellectual audience, the scholars, the jurists, the high clergy, they still operated entirely in Latin. He had to engage them on their own terms, in their own language, to convince them that the language spoken by the common people, the vulgari, was worthy of serious intellectual consideration. He was maneuvering to elevate Italian status on the world stage.
And just as he was developing these profound intellectual arguments for global unity, fate seemed to offer him a real-world chance to test them. Henry VII of Luxembourg was elected King of Germany in 1308 and announced his plan to travel to Rome to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor.
Dante saw Henry VII as the promised redeemer, the figure who could enact the political theories he'd laid out, and he became Henry's most passionate, almost evangelical advocate in Italy.
His enthusiasm was relentless. He wrote a manifesto, an open letter, urging all Italian lords to submit peacefully to Henry, and then he wrote directly to his mortal enemy, the Florentine government, demanding that they submit.
And perhaps most shockingly, he wrote directly to Henry VII himself, advising the emperor to ignore the regional disturbances in Lombardy and instead march directly on Florence, the city he believed was the root of all Italian corruption and chaos. His desire for universal justice had completely superseded his loyalty to his hometown.
This intense, passionate advocacy culminated in De Monarchia, written around 1312, his most explicit and famous political treatise.
De Monarchia is a radical and powerful argument for the separation of power. Dante argued fiercely that both the Pope and the Emperor received their authority directly from God, possessing equal ultimate rank. The Pope was supreme in spiritual matters, absolutely, but the Emperor was supreme in all earthly temporal matters and could not be challenged by the Church.
That position completely undermined the papal claim to temporal authority, which had been the basis of the Guelph faction's power and the reason for the Pope's involvement in Florence's civil war. Dante was retroactively validating the Ghibelline position using theological and philosophical arguments.
It was a perfect, coherent political vision born of personal pain and intellectual rigor. But the real world is rarely so neat. Henry VIII faced relentless opposition, particularly from the Angevin king of Naples, Robert, and Henry eventually died unexpectedly in August 1313 while invading.
And with that sudden death, the imperial dream just collapsed. The Ghibelline cause was in ruins, and Dante's political path to return through a triumphant emperor was definitively closed forever. His intellectual journey had to take one final epic.
And the ultimate synthesis of Dante's political philosophy, his spiritual journey, and his personal rage is, of course, the Divine Comedy. It is a work of staggering scope, written entirely during his exile, spanning from approximately 1306 to 1320.
The narrative conceit is just ingenious. It recounts Dante's fictional journey realm, hell, purgatory, and paradise, and the symbolic weight of that year.
Because that was the very year he served as prior and his political fate was sealed.
Exactly. He crafts this layered narrative structure. He's first guided by the Roman poet Virgil, who represents human reason and philosophy, through the dark chaos of hell and the painful repentance.
And then he's guided by Beatrice, representing divine love and theology, through the brilliance of paradise.
And the architecture of the afterlife reflects a perfect medieval cosmology. Each of the three canticas is divided into 9 parts: 9 circles of hell, 9 rings of Mount Purgatory, and 9 celestial spheres in paradise, culminating here in heaven.
The genius, as we noted earlier, is the dual purpose. It functions absolutely as a profound discussion of Christian morality and the fate of the human soul. But simultaneously, it is a detailed, coded, and highly partisan political commentary on contemporary Italian affairs. Dante populates the afterlife with his neighbors, his rivals, and even the popes responsible for his exile.
It's a political map disguised as a spiritual map, and by tracing the composition timeline, we can see his political ideology shifting in real time, like tectonic plates moving under the strain of exile.
So let's start with Inferno, written between roughly 1306 and 1309. This phase reflects the period when Dante was still seeking some form of amnesty, still clinging to the hope of reconciliation with certain Florentine powers, even appealing to men like Corso Donati.
And that desire for reconciliation is reflected in his political balancing act within the text. He invents limbo, the first circle, to house virtuous non-Christians: Virgil, Homer, Plato, Aristotle, showing profound respect for class even outside of Christian salvation.
And when he encounters the political factions, he initially stresses his moderate Guelph background. He places the most prominent Ghibelline leader of Florence, Farinata degli Uberti, in the 6th circle, alongside the heretics, in line with established papal policy. Frederick II, the arch-imperial enemy, is also in.
And to show his complete break with the extremism of the White Guelph, he famously places Cavalcante de Cavalcante, the father of his beloved friend Guido, in the same fiery tomb as Farinata. He's sending a mess. Both the Ghibellines and the fanatical factions of his own former party are equally damned in his sight. He is judging all of Florence.
But The Inferno is also where the personal rage is most potent. We see this in the encounter with the glutton Siaco in the Third Circle, who offers one of the first explicit prophecies about the black and white gulf split, blaming the city's ruin on pride and avarice. It transforms the poem from a journey into a specific localized indictment.
And of course, the Second Circle, reserved for lust, holds that famous, deeply human encounter with Francesca da Rimini, who, along with her lover Paul, is brutal. And Dante portrays her so sympathetic, focusing on the tragic. It's a moment of profound emotional set against the backdrop.
But by the time he starts writing Purgatorio, around 1309 to 1314, everything changed. Henry VIII has arrived in Italy, and Dante has publicly thrown in his lot with the imperial cause. He's given up on returning through any means other than a grand imperial triumph, and this enforced distance allows him to fully express his pro-imperial views without fear of immediate Florentine retribution.
So he uses Purgatorio to revise the political legend. We see figures who were condemned by the Gulf Pape suddenly afforded greater.
Exactly. King Manfred, Frederick II's son, whom Dante's faction fought against, is no longer in hell. He is among the excommunicates, waiting outside purgatory, but he is described beautifully as handsome and of noble aspect, demonstrating this new, generous Ghibelline view of history. Dante even praises the Ghibelline warrior Bonconte da Montefeltro, who fell at Campoldino, the very battle Dante fought in as a Gulf soldier.
He's reconciling with the past, forgiving his political, and shifting his entire moral framework. Even his personal connections soft. He encounters Forse Donati, a relative of the Black Gulfs, whom he describes as an old friend undergoing pure. Hell was for eternal damnation. Purgatory is for shared hope and eventual redemption, a path he now believes even his former foe walked.
The Purgatorio thus becomes his platform for political lamentation. In Canto 6, he delivers this blistering apostrophe against Italy, crying out, "Ah, enslave Italy, inn of grief, ship without pilot in a mighty storm." This is where his political rage finds its most elegant and universal expression, railing against the weakness of the empire and the resulting political vacuum.
And he anchors this hope in Henry VII's arrival, prophesizing that the heir to the empire, a reference to Henry's son, John of Bohemia, would rise up and free the church from its captivity in France, a clear reference to the Avignon Papal.
Finally, we reach Paradiso from about 1315 to 1321, the grand visionary conclusion, written largely while he was staying in Verona, under the protection of the powerful Ghibelline figure Congrande della Scala. By now, Henry VII has died, but Dante's faith in the imperial ideal remains supreme.
And Dante repays Congrande's hospitality by incorporating him into the cosmos. He encounters his ancestor Cacciagrida on the planet Mars, year of warrior, and Cacciagrida prophesizes the greatness of Congrande, predicting he would become a warrior leader whose magnificence is known to all.
The attacks on the church, which began in Convivio and were hinted at in Purgatorio, they reached their absolute climax in Paradiso. Dante launches a scathing, high-level attack on Pope John XXII, whose election cemented the Avignon Papacy. St. Peter himself denounces Pope Boniface VIII, the pope who engineered Dante's exile, using this imagery of the papal chair being stained by corruption.
It's the ultimate vindication, as Dante, the exile, having suffered ruin at the hands of Boniface VIII, now uses the voice of the first apostle, St. Peter, to condemn that pope to damnation.
The poem ends with Dante holding out hope. Not a tangible political hope, but a theological vision that God will eventually restore order to Italy, a theme that transcends the immediate failure of Henry VII. It concludes with his intensely human hope that he might someday return to Florence in triumph, not as a prior, but as a poet, crowned with laurels for his literary accomplishments.
That triumphant return to Florence never came during Dante's lifetime. The end of his life was marked by this final moment of profound political and moral choice that really cemented his identity as an exile who prioritized dignity over...
In May 1315, Florence offered the exiles a path home, but it came with a monumental condition. They had to pay a fine and critically perform a public act of penitence at the baptistry of San Giovanni. This was an act of public humiliation, essentially admitting guilt for the trumped-up charges of 1302.
And Dante's response was immediate and absolute. He wrote a letter to a friend, asserting that he would not subject himself to such degradation. He refused to walk through that gate as a pardoned criminal, especially since he was now internationally famous due to the circulation of the Inferno. He chose intellectual dignity over physical comfort or reconciliation with a corrupt...
That refusal was heroic and it was dangerous. Because of it, the Black Gulf regime reissued the death sentence against him and his son. Around 1318, he left Verona and settled in Ravenna, hosted by Guido Novello da Polenta.
And by this time, the sources suggest Dante was finally growing weary of the relentless political factionalism that had consumed his entire adult. Ravenna offered peace and stability. His family was finally reunited, and his son Pietro was even granted church office, which helped secure their financial future.
He completed Paradiso shortly before his death. In August 1321, he undertook one final act of public service, traveling to Venice on a diplomatic mission for Ravenna. He fell ill on the return journey, likely with malaria, and died on the night of September 13, 1321, at the age of 55.
And the political irony followed him even after death. He was interred in Ravenna. As Dante's fame skyrocketed in the centuries that followed, Florence repeatedly requested the transfer of his home.
And Ravenna consistently denied. Florence, in their subsequent realization of the magnitude of the genius they exiled, built him an elaborate tomb in the Basilica of Santa Croce, recognizing him as one of the great sons of the city. That tomb, however, remains empty to this day, a permanent monument to their political failure and his moral refusal.
So, what is the ultimate enduring impact proud Florentine who died in exile? We often talk about him as a literary giant, but let's go deeper. His profound theological and philosophical secured the Divine Comedy as a timeless cornerstone of Western.
But his impact is also fundamentally practical. Dante is absolutely the architect of the Italian. His deliberate, rigorous determination to promote and refine the Tuscan dialect as a worthy literary language was monumental. When Italy finally achieved unification in the 19th century, the language adopted across the peninsula, the language that unified the various regions, was fundamentally based on the Tuscan vernacular that Dante championed in the early 14th century.
He lived a life defined by extraordinary contradictions. A Gulf partisan forced to become a Ghibelline idealist, a man whose greatest love was largely platonic and symbolic, yet whose works inspired centuries of drama, opera, and art based on those deeply human and often brutal relationships he immortalized.
His immediate political ambitions failed spectacularly. Henry VIII died, Italy remained fragmented, but his intellectual legacy successfully provided Italy with a unified moral compass, a historical narrative, and, most importantly, a shared language that transcended all the local rivals at exile.
So if we synthesize this entire journey, Dante didn't just endure his exile. He harnessed the enforced distance from Florence to achieve a level of intellectual and artistic synthesis that simply could not have occurred had he remained stuck in the 2-month cycles of the College of Priors. His personal tragedy was Europe's cultural gain because he was forced to look past the petty interests of the Cerci and Donati families and confront the vast universal issues of Christendom, empire, and language.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, Dante's experience offers us a profound truth. Political and personal collapse can be the most potent fuel for profound, lasting creation. He sought to unify Italy under the banner of a Holy Roman Emperor, a dream that died swiftly, but ultimately, he achieved a different, far more resilient form of unification. Unification through poetry and a shared national language, a legacy no political faction could ever confirm.
It's an extraordinary transformation. When you read the Divine, you are walk complex, but you are also dive half